You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get started with this week's episode, an apology from me because I gave you the wrong custom YouTube link last week, and we need to get that fixed because the YouTube subscribers are growing. We want to continue that growing. So again, that website is www.youtube.com/C as in Charlie /Hazard Ground Podcast, all together, one word. Again, youtube.com/C /Hazard Ground Podcast. Make sure you guys subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow us that way. And another mistake I made, apparently, podcasts are no longer on iTunes. They're on Apple Podcasts. So when I said iTunes, I mean Apple Podcasts, but wherever Apple Podcasts are available, please go leave a rating and a review because we really love the feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. And certainly the more reviews we get, the more this podcast can grow, the bigger their audience gets. And of course, we all benefit from that. As well, the Amazon promotion, go to our website, hazardground.com. Make sure you click on the Amazon link at the bottom of the homepage or under the sponsors tab and do your normal Amazon shopping. We'll get a percentage of whatever you spend. We donate it right back to some of the charities you've heard featured here on the Hazard Ground. And we know Father's Day just passed, but if you're looking for that extra gift for that special someone, that special dad in your life, go to the reading list on our website, hazardground.com. A lot of great books out there, so please check that out as well. All of our guests who have written a book, the link directly to buy that book is on our website, hazardground.com. And then finally, a listener email worth noting that we like to share with you guys. And it just reads from Steve in Milwaukee. Gentlemen, I just finished episode 169, Gary Wetzel. As an acquaintance of Gary's, I've heard many times Gary's story, but through Mark's brilliant interview skills, I learned new views of Gary's life that I never knew before. I was glued to the podcast from start to end. Thank you, gentlemen, for your professionalism each week. As a former soldier that suffers from PTSD, I find listening to the Hazard Ground helps me in dealing with issues I fight each day. And now, having retired from the Milwaukee PD after 25 years of service, I have heard new programs I can get involved with to occupy my time and volunteer. I've been working my way through each archived episode, currently on episode 132, Patrick Murphy. Again, thank you for all you do, which will never be enough. Respectfully, Steve in Milwaukee. Steve, honored and humbled by your comments and your thoughts. Certainly thank you so much for sharing them, and keep the comments coming. Everyone, you mean so much to us as far as the audience of this show and the followers of this podcast. We truly appreciate all the kind words you send our way, and it keeps us doing what we're doing, helping to chronicle and tell these stories and be part of history. So thank you again very, very much. With all that out of the way, let's get on to this week's episode. Joining us this week on the Hazard Ground Podcast is a guest of a very unique nature. He spent 23 years in the United States Army, was a Green Beret, and ultimately retired as a CW4. He had multiple deployments throughout the world throughout his 23-year career. But what we'll focus on is his time in Detachment A as part of the Special Forces, a unit that has only recently become declassified by the United States military, and he's written a book about it titled Special Forces Berlin, Clandestine Cold War Operations of the U.S. Army's Elite from 1956 to 1990. He is Jim Stejskal, joining us on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Jim, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's good to talk to you, Mark. Glad to be here.
Okay, very interesting story. This is something in doing research that I had not known existed. We had actually been requested by some listeners to tell the story of Detachment A. And what we're going to focus on mostly is your Cold War operations in Berlin post-World War II. Obviously, you've been in the military a long time in your career, and I forgot to mention this in the open, your career actually spanned after the United States Army into the CIA, which obviously we could talk a little bit about that on some broad terms, but we'll get into that as well. So start back at the beginning for me, though, Jim. How and why did you get in the Army?
To paraphrase Bill Cosby, I started out as a child. No, my father was military. He was a combat engineer in World War II, took part in the Battle of the Bulge. I always looked up to him, which I think is a good thing with your father. And he, I think he subliminally recruited me. I had two older brothers. Neither one of them served in the military. One of them was a bit left of center and became an artist. Despite that, I love him very much. My middle brother became an FBI agent, and so it was up to me to join the Army. And my dad was happy. My mom was not so convinced at first, but I think probably the thing that pushed me towards Special Forces was my love of history, reading about the OSS and the Americans in the Philippines during World War II, behind the lines work in France and things like that. And then, reading all the books coming up. And eventually, one time my father came home from, he was in the reserves after the war, brought home a training guide for Special Forces, not a recruitment brochure, and gave that to me. And that was probably the final recruitment call right there.
Let me ask you, though, it's interesting because Special Forces technically wasn't created until, I think, the early 50s, 52, if I recall. So it wasn't something that people had thought of back then. How did your father and you kind of know so much about it at that point?
Well, this, I knew about OSS and the agency and all this, all these types of units just from my reading of history. My father had done some of the Combined Operations Group training in England during World War II, which essentially was the British commandos working with other specialized units like engineers, and some of the American engineers went through that training. So I had heard about all these things, and then it was the early 60s when my father brought home this training, this recruitment brochure. So I had been working through the whole history and found out about Special Forces through this recruitment brochure, and started to do some very heavy research into it. Yeah, you're right. It was created in 52. With the shutdown of the OSS, the Army finally had the sense to look at unconventional warfare a little bit more closely. And the actual stand-up of the first Special Forces unit, the 10th Special Forces Group, happened in 1953. And Berlin actually came out of 10th Special Forces in 1956. Gotcha. Because 10th Special Forces Group was posted to Bad Tolz, Germany. And at some point, the Berlin Brigade commander decided that he needed some assistance for his wartime mission and requested basically demolitions teams to help them if they were going to do a breakout in case of war. So what was sent up there was essentially a Special Forces company, and they were sent in undercover as an infantry unit, basically. But that was 1956. So the unit was in existence from 1956 to 1990.
Okay, so when you enlist in the Army, what year is it, and how quickly do you get to your Special Forces sort of training or assessment and selection phase?
I guess I'm bouncing around a bit because I'm talking about a unit and I'm talking about myself. So
right.
Forgive me on that regard. I came in 1973. Okay. I went to the university for a while. Decided I really didn't see anything I was interested in studying for a long period of time, and said, well, I do know what I want to do, and that was the Army. So I went off and enlisted. The year they stopped the draft, my number was 4. So they quit the draft, and I was forced to enlist. So I did that and scared the hell out of my mom because she thought I was going to Vietnam, but I didn't. Anyway, I enlisted, came in as an infantryman, went into the 82nd, managed to escape the 82nd and passed the entrance exams for Special Forces, and then went to the qualification course.
What was the entrance exam back then?
Well, you had to take a written test, the Special Forces Aptitude Battery or Qualification Battery, I think. And then there was a series of physical things that you had to do. You passed the Army PT test. You had to be able to swim in uniform 50 meters. That was just to show up at the front door for the qualification. And then you went through the assessment and selection. They didn't call it assessment and selection at that time, but the first 4 weeks were essentially separating the wheat from the chaff.
Gotcha. Okay. So the actual physical portion of getting into SF at that time was what?
Well, as I said, you had to pass the written test. You had to pass the Army PT test and swim test. That got you into the training facility at Fort Bragg on Smoke Bomb Hill. And then you had to pass all the internal tests that they threw at you while you were, it was the first 4 weeks were basically a miniature ranger school. And you could get thrown out at any particular time if you failed to meet the standards. You had to do timed runs, untimed runs. You just had to stay up with the instructors. But you also did the land navigation courses. You had to do. I have to think back. It's been a while since I did it.
Sure.
But a number of physical and mental exams that you had to pass. And if you made it through those first 4 weeks, then you were good to do phase 2 and phase 3. So, although we did lose quite a few people in the phase 2 and phase 3 portions as well.
Sure.
So we came in. I was told my class was 113 people when we started out. We ended up with 12.
Wow. And that's totally separate from the actual qualification course, correct?
Well, qualification course would cut out about 50%, but the attrition rate through the entire course was also pretty high.
Okay, so once you finish phase 2 and phase 3, you're SF qualified at that point.
Once you finish the phase 3 training, you were SF qualified.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So how quickly do you get to a unit after you complete and get your tab? Complete SF and get your tab.
Fairly quickly. I think we spent about another week on Fort Bragg getting things straightened out, and then they had to choose. You, of course, got the option of choosing where you wanted to go, and then they sent you where they wanted you to go. So I managed to luck out. I chose 10 Special Forces Group, which had at that time 1 battalion in Germany and 2 battalions in Massachusetts at Fort Devens. And I actually got my wish, so I ended up in Fort Devens.
All right, what's next for you at that point in time? Because what year and month is this? You said you enlisted in 73, so how quickly?
This was late 74. I got up to the unit. I spent about 2 years on a team in Massachusetts. And during one of my deployments overseas to Germany, I ran across a guy who was a German speaker. He was we were in the field and he was role-playing member of the resistance, the underground, but he spoke fluent German. He looked like a German as far as I knew. And I asked my team sergeant about where he came from. The guy said, well, actually, he's an American. He's from Berlin. And I had no clue that the U.S. existed. A lot of people did not at that time. And so when I came back, I was working on my German anyway. And after about a year, I made application to the Pentagon, to the Special Forces branch, and said, hey, I would like to go to Berlin if there's an opportunity. And it just so happened the lady must have liked me because there was an opportunity in 1977, and I went to Berlin the first time.
All right. Now, when you get to Berlin, this is not when you become part of Detachment A, correct? Or is it?
No, it is. You're selected. You're selected based on their requirements. So you have to be Special Forces qualified. You have had to have time on a team.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to speak an Eastern European language.
Did you know?
German.
I'm sorry to cut you off. Did you know at the time that that's what you were going to when you said, I want to go to Berlin?
Yes.
Okay.
I knew that there was a Detachment A. Nobody would talk about it. Nobody would tell me much about it. But I knew that there was a Special Forces unit in Berlin called Detachment A, and that's what I applied for.
Got it. Okay. Did you know the nature of what the unit was doing?
Not really. Thinking back, I cannot even remember what my expectations were. But I knew they worked down in West Germany with the regular Special Forces units, but I really had no clue that they were in civilian clothes all the time, that I knew you had to be able to speak German or some other useful language. But I didn't have a real good clue of what I was getting into until I did get there.
Okay. So when you actually arrive, kind of give me the lay of the land and what are you told?
You've heard the term pig looking at a wristwatch.
Yeah.
So actually, they tell you you're going to Germany, get rid of all your Special Forces related junk. Don't take it with you. You're flying into Berlin, which was pretty high class for me. Take a Pan Am jet from New York to Frankfurt, and then Frankfurt to Berlin. You get picked up at the airport and taken into the compound where we were operating, and then you basically get the brief. This is where we're at. You had to have a top secret clearance at that time. It was unusual for anybody to have a top secret clearance unless you were in military intelligence or something along that line. But every person in Detachment A had to have a top secret clearance because our mission was classified at that level. So it was eye-opening, that's for sure.
The nature of what you were about to do, it's so non-combat oriented. It's so different than that. Did you feel like all that training that you had done and everything that you had went through to become a Green Beret sort of was like, well, what the hell did I do this for?
No, yes and no, not ever. It is military training. It's because Detachment A was really the embodiment of the Office of Special Services, Strategic Services, mandate during World War II. They would send guys in civilian clothes to be advisors to resistance forces behind the lines. And so you had to know the military skills, but you had to learn additional skills to be able to operate in an urban environment. And that was basically agency tradecraft. So that's when I started learning the kind of tradecraft that the CIA uses, because it was.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, though, Jim, like when you say tradecraft, the first thing that pops into my head is you're a spy, right? Like, like that's not kind of what we know SF to do now. It's direct action. It's combat oriented. So I didn't know if it was different back then in a sense where, sure, I mean, we have SF, we have Green Berets who sort of, become one of the populace in the area that they're operating in for intelligence purposes and things of that nature. But, again, when you say tradecraft, I think a whole different thing than direct action that we typically know Special Forces to do.
Well, direct action is one of the missions of Special Forces. Unconventional warfare and guerrilla warfare is one of the other ones. And if you go now to the 4th Battalions, Special Forces groups, that's what they're trying to get back to. Yeah, we're doing direct action now, but it's, during Vietnam, Special Forces was doing counterinsurgency operations and working with local units. So the mission changes according to the need, but in Berlin, the need was for a guy to be able to work undercover on the streets of Berlin, as well as in the field as a Special Forces soldier. So yeah, you're using tradecraft. The only thing we're not really doing is recruiting spies. That was the agency's job. But the tradecraft that they use, non-technical communications systems, surveillance, counter-surveillance, all those kind of things, you had to incorporate into your training just to be able to survive in that urban environment.
Right. All right. So
that was the idea.
Give me an example of kind of like what an operation for you would be like, or what a day would be like. I mean, you throw on your civilian clothes and you don some sort of cap to mingle among the populace. What are you looking for? How are you interacting? Sort of kind of give me an example if you can remember one.
Well, as I said, the idea was to survive, but you might have a mission to destroy a target inside West Berlin or inside East Berlin. Initially, our mission in case of war would have been to slow the Russians down. Some of the things that you would do would be take out power plants, take out railway switch yards, be able to retard the Soviet advance on West Germany. The EUCOM commander one time said, "Your mission is to buy me time." In other words, the forces in West Germany were fully expecting the 70 or 80 division onslaught from the Soviets. Our mission was to try to slow them down as much as possible. And Berlin was a central point in the transit plan for the Warsaw Pact. There's a railway line that goes around the city, and that was one of our key targets. So your day-to-day mission is to plan how to survive once war is declared. So that might be going in and living in a safe house away from the Americans for a while until you were prepared to cross the wall and go into East Germany and take on your mission as for direct action. Some of the teams were going to be reporting from highways, reporting intelligence back by radio to tell the Air Force where the Soviet units were moving. So your day-to-day life is to prepare for this and develop those non-technical communication systems so you could talk amongst your team members, places to hide within the city, places to cross the wall to get to your targets on the outside, or perhaps if you had targets on the inside of the city, either in East or West Berlin, to plan how you're going to do that. And we had immense amounts of information. If you're in the country that you're going to be operating, and you've got a leg up on everybody. And we had access to all the mapping, all the photographs, all the East German phone books that you would want to get a hold of. Plus, we could actually access some of our targets on a day-to-day basis. The military liaison mission was one of our co-units in Berlin, and their mission was basically overt spying. The Russians had observers in West Germany, and we had observers in East Germany. So our guys would be able to travel with these teams and go out and watch them do their work. But at the same time, you could say, "Hey, today let's drive by this bridge." And we could do a drive-by, take all the photographs and measurements you wanted, and move on. So it was an ideal location to have all the tools, all the information you needed for your wartime mission.
Was there ever a time where you felt like your cover might be blown, or you felt like you were in immediate danger for your life doing an operation?
No, not really. Not with that unit. We knew our cover was basically marginal at best. We knew that if the Russians would have been able to surprise the unit, they could have come in and killed all of us. So we didn't expect them to do that, though. The unit was set up in such a way that we expected to have, 12 to 24 hours at the very minimum to disperse away from the unit and go to ground. We had equipment caches throughout the city that had the additional equipment we would need. So the plan was to get away from the unit as fast as possible. Your cover being a conventional soldier in Berlin went out the window, and you adopted a new cover, which was already prepared. And that included documentation that was made by the best in the business. And you would basically just become a chameleon. You'd change one day into something else.
All right. So, as this kind of Cold War operation is going on here, how do you know the work you're doing is effective? Like, I mean, because again, it's so different from combat in the sense where you can defeat an enemy, you can take a hill, you can overcome a town, whatever it may be. But in your world at this point in time, how do you know that you're being effective?
Well, that's that begs that age-old question. How do you know what you don't know? If you're an infantry unit out in West Germany practicing infantry assaults, you assume your tactics are correct. You might find out later on that they're not. But the only way that I can address that is to say that the Russians, we found out after the wall came down, the Russians assumed there were 800 Special Forces people in West Berlin, and they had earmarked Spetsnaz units to try to find the unit and to destroy it. They were very worried about it.
So how does that mission end for you?
Had it come to World War III, do you mean?
I mean, I wasn't thinking on those terms, and now that you say it, it makes total sense. I mean, I guess when the Berlin Wall comes down, does that mean that mission ends there?
Well, in that case, yeah. Had war come, I don't think it would have ended well for anybody, either Russians or Americans. I don't think we thought about that much. But in 1990, when the wall comes down, then basically our mission of stopping the Warsaw Pact moving forward went away. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. In retrospect, and at the time, actually, we argued that the need for that unit did not go away, and I don't think it has. I think we need that kind of unconventional warfare skill of being able to work undercover, not just doing direct action missions, but to be able to go into a country and work with resistance forces, not being seen as a military unit. I think that kind of skill, we still need it. And for the most part, I think a lot of it has gone away.
Really?
Yeah.
There
are some special units that do specific types of intelligence work, but nothing that would compare to like the Jedburgh teams during World War II, or Detachment A during the Cold War.
Is being stationed behind enemy lines the toughest challenge in your military career?
That's a hard question. Let's put it this way. In my military career, there was lots of time to be bored, and then a few times when I was terrified out of my wits. That was one of the more interesting and more intense moments of my career. Probably the only other time that I was equally nervous was being on the beach and watching two teams of SEALs come into my beach and being the only one there, and then realizing that they didn't know who I was. That was very worrying. So would they open up on me before or after I got a chance to say hi? Anyway. It all ended well. Let's put it that way.
After this Detachment A mission ends, I guess holistically, where does Detachment A go, and do you stay with the unit?
The unit is basically disbanded. Its classified designation was 39th Special Forces. That designation has now gone to renamed the U.S. Special Forces Detachment in Korea. That's now the 39th Special Force. So essentially, the unit disappears, and all the guys are dispersed back to regular Special Forces units.
Why did it take so long for the military to declassify Detachment A?
Probably because nobody tried. Nobody was worried about it. Had the Army had its way, it probably still would be classified. There were quite a few people that said it shouldn't. My reasoning was the unit no longer existed. The skills no longer existed. The mission no longer existed. So it was time to write a history, both of the unit and the people that were in it. And so my book essentially was the pry bar that got the unit declassified. Otherwise, nothing would have ever happened.
Did you receive any pushback for writing the book or trying to get the stuff declassified?
I went down to Fort Bragg and did a briefing. I briefed the commanding general of U.S. Army Special Operations Command, and he was personally supportive, but officially he said that there was nothing that he could add to it. While I was briefing him, I had 3 other representatives in there from the SOCOM history branch, and they all said, no, you can't write this. This is all classified information. And I said, yeah, I understand it's classified, and that's why they have what is called the Defense Pre-Publication Review Board. And so I wrote my manuscript. I submitted it to Department of Defense, and Department of Defense cleared it and said it's okay for publication with very minimal redactions. So.
All right, so as we mentioned, the Berlin Wall falls in 89-90, and what happens to you next? The unit disbands. Where do you go?
I had actually left the unit the previous spring. I had come back to the United States. The night of November 9th, 1989, I received a telephone call from one of my friends and said, hey, turn on CNN. And I saw that Berlin, the wall had fallen. And the next day, I was on an airplane to Berlin. So I was at the Brandenburg Gate on November 10th. Playing around there. Then I came back and was doing my job again. So I was in Northern Virginia, assigned to a unit in Northern Virginia, and I spent the next 6 years in the United States. Well, I was assigned to the United States, but I was doing a lot of TDYs overseas.
Now you get to Somalia, correct?
Correct.
Okay. That's a story we've told many times. What was your role there?
Before the Marines came in, they sent Special Forces people into Somalia to prepare the way, essentially advanced force operations, to reconnoiter the airfields, the beaches, the roads between cities. And that was our mission.
How long were you there for?
I was there for 4 months until I was withdrawn after my truck hit a anti-tank mine.
Do you remember what month that was?
It was December 1993.
Okay, so you were there for
1992.
I was going to say, okay, I just want to. You were there for the actual Black Hawk Down incident if it was 93, but
no, I was still recovering in October of 93.
Just as somebody who was there and somebody who had done high-level, high-danger missions, when you watch Black Hawk Down happen from stateside, what are you thinking?
I'm kind of prejudiced on this because I was sat in on a briefing. We were still there. We were still helping. And at that point, I was convalescing, but I was still taking part in talking some of the missions and things like this, we had a briefing by someone from Fort Bragg, and basically we were telling them what to expect, what kind of resistance, what kind of militia forces that you might run into. And the attitude that we got from the lead of that unit was, don't worry about it. We're not going to have any problem. There's nothing that these Somalis can do to us, which we kind of thought was a real bad attitude to have when you're going into an area that you know little about. And so that sort of prejudiced us a bit about the outfit. We had also seen that their operational footprint had been reduced to basically living in the main airfield and not getting out much. They were essentially doing combat patrols out into the city. We had no physical presence in the city itself, and when that start happens, that's when you lose your intelligence network. You lose any eyes and ears that you might have had on the ground, and essentially, we basically, as far as I see it, we gave the terrain back to the enemy.
I get that we're Monday morning quarterbacking this thing, and it was a long, long time ago. So, again, I'm not trying to jam you up with a question. I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts were on.
Well, it may be that some of my thinking is in retrospect, but it really, it didn't surprise us that there was going to be resistance from the bad guys. The Black Hawk Down episode itself was a surprise because it was so really catastrophic compared to anything else that had happened up to that point.
Sure,
but I don't think it was unexpected.
With the benefit of hindsight, do you think the plan was right? Do you think we had the right idea as far as how we wanted to execute the raid, or was that just one of those things that you never really can control when combat kicks off?
Well, yeah, the plan goes out the window at first contact. Yeah, no, I think the task force was doing its job. It was doing what it had to do. I think the overall plan was probably what was at fault. We had made enemies of certain people. You can't go into a country and expect that you're going to be able to easily separate the combatants in a revolution like what was happening at that time. And there were different militias on the ground. And when you pick one militia over the other, then you can expect that the disadvantaged militia is going to take it really badly. And that was basically what happened. And then when you go in, there was such a fine margin of error that when something bad happened, the errors or the badness multiplied very quickly. It's one, on one hand, the plan worked, but then there's one small thing that throws the plan out of whack, and that's what happened.
All right. So after that, your deployments continue throughout the world. I know it's a lot because, again, it was 23 years, but kind of what's coming up next for you? Where are you headed? Where are you going type missions?
Well, let's see. I did. I was in the first Desert War. I also spent time in a couple of different interesting African nations, helping out with neo-evacs, and I was in Zaire during the when Mobutu was overthrown, things like that. Somalia was one. And after Somalia, after I was put back into my boots, I went to the Balkans, was supporting the UN Profor before the Americans came in. We had about 5 Americans that were helping support General Rose, the British commander of UNPROFOR. And then about 1996, I was discharge with a medical discharge from the Army, and went on. I was expecting to be, wasn't really sure. I thought about becoming a photographer, but then I got a call from a gentleman that said, would you be interested in talking about a job? And it turned out to be the agency. So I said yes. And for the next 13 years, worked with the agency, a lot in Africa, but also in Europe and the Far East. So,
how much did your background in Detachment A lead you to the CIA itself, and I guess their attractiveness of you?
I would probably say it was the reason I was recruited.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
Between my work with with Detachment A and my work in Northern Virginia, I had already been in contact with a number of their officers, and when they found out I had gotten out, they said, "Well, why don't you try working with us?" So I did.
All right. I know I have to tread carefully here, and I'm sure the listening audience understands as far as the CIA is concerned. And you said you did a lot of time in Africa. Now, there were bin Laden ties to Africa and the Sudan and everything else. I mean, I don't really know how to phrase this question the right way. How much do you feel like you had an awareness that 9/11 was brewing prior to it happening?
I'm not going to say that I was that prescient. We saw a lot of things happening in Africa. I mean, the bombings of the American embassy in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, we saw those happen. And you also saw the attempted bombings against the Twin Towers in New York.
In 93, yeah.
So, yeah. And so it was an ongoing thing. It was like, what is the next big thing going to happen? When I was in Detachment A, we were tasked with counterterrorism. In fact, Detachment A was the first counterterrorist unit in the U.S. military. That happened about 1974, before I got there. But when I got there, counterterrorism was one of the unit's additional missions. And that was because of all the terrorist activity in Europe. We saw the bombings against the U.S. forces, the Red Army faction, the kidnapping of General Dozier in Italy. These are all things that were going on. And then we also started to see the rise of the Palestinian terrorist groups, and it would morph into other types of terrorism. I would say that when we were in Somalia, 92, 93, that was not terrorism. It was militia warfare. But terrorism came out of that militia warfare. Now you've got Al-Shabaab and groups like that. So terrorism has been an evolving thing since late 1960s. We've seen it turn into a modern kind of contingency. So all these things are happening are all around us. So you might not be able to predict something like 9/11, but they're out there trying to come up with something like that. So it was once again a thing that you'd say, well, it makes sense.
How has terrorism sort of developed over the years? I mean, again, the next big thing, but do you get a sense in sort of your sense of history, or at least working in this field for so long, that is terrorism still the same, just executed in different manners, or has it grown and developed and matured in a certain sense?
It's changed quite a bit. I mean, when we first started talking about it in the 70s and 80s, we used to argue about just the definition of terrorism. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, and that's basically what it comes down to. Is it's a definition, and I think what has changed it is is really the weaponry and the ability to cause greater amounts of damage than before. In the 1800s, it was one man with a Molotov cocktail or a stick of dynamite or a pistol. Nowadays, it's a guy with a surface-to-air missile or, who knows, a biological weapon or a nuclear weapon.
Or a passport in this case.
Yeah, and aircraft and pilot training. So it's all changed, but I also think you've got to blame or to count in at least social media. Terrorists are much better equipped now to get their message out to their supporters. And they obviously don't see themselves as terrorists. They see themselves as freedom fighters for their own cause, no matter what.
I'm just curious, and this could be totally opinion based. I'm not necessarily looking for an official answer, but how much do we as the United States sort of welcome terrorism by our geopolitical dealings and aspirations, so to speak? I mean, more plainly, if we were involved less in world affairs, would we less be the subject of terrorism?
You might be overseas, but we're still going to have terrorism over here. I mean, you've got domestic terrorists and you've got international terrorists. You've got terrorists on the right and the left. So I don't think that would be the end all to our involvement with terrorism. I do think there is a great deal of hubris in how we handle the world, and without getting into too much controversial conversation or discussion, you can look at how we deal with Israel. And on one hand, we're supporting the nation of Israel, but on the other hand, how much does that do to our relations with the majority of the people in the Middle East who do not support what Israel is doing? So, it's not a zero-sum game on any hand, but every action begets an opposite reaction. It might not be an equal one, but yeah, our involvement overseas, I think, needs to be extremely well thought out and careful. We look at our relations with Iran, especially at this moment. What do we want to do to help Iran get through the COVID crisis? Or what do we want to do to make sure it's the people that don't suffer and not the government? What things would mitigate their desire to, if any, to destroy Israel? So there's a lot of things to think about, and I don't think any one person has the answer to all of them. But you have to have relations with other countries, but for all that you do, I think you can also expect that there's going to be somebody that is displeased with the way you do it.
Are we better equipped now for counterinsurgency and sort of anti-terrorism operations than ever before?
We're very well equipped at direct action and taking out the leadership. The problem is that doesn't end the terrorism. Militarily, strategically, I think we're pretty good at that. Politically, on the other hand, the strategy of how to deal with these disadvantaged groups, I don't think we're very well prepared to handle most of them.
Could Detachment A or should Detachment A sort of exist today?
I think the 4th Battalions in the Special Forces groups are supposed to be picking up the baton and carrying that forward. I would like to see that happen. Charlie Cleveland, who was Lieutenant General, retired, was one of the big pushers behind that. His vision of how to go forward with that 4th Battalion and doing unconventional warfare, I think was good. And if that continues, I think that will be a good supplement for Detachment A. Detachment A was very specialized, oriented towards East Germany. The 4th Battalions are oriented more broadly, and I think that's a good thing. Direct action, I don't see direct action as it's one of our skills that we have to keep up. I don't think we should try to be emulating CAG or ST6.
Is Special Forces too commonplace now? Is it too widely known? I mean, because of media and, the war on terror now, Iraq and Afghanistan lasting, nearly 2 decades, we know so much more about SF now than we ever did before. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's inevitable. I think what is bad is the military's reliance on special operations to get things done all the time. I think we need more units that are capable of doing more things. I think our infantry units need to be concerned not only with conventional ground force operations, but they also need to understand how to do counter guerrilla operations, things like that. I think the British Army is a little bit more, although tiny, is a little bit more adept at doing multiple missions. I think the military still keeps a fairly good cover on most of the operations that SF and special operations units do. So I think some notoriety is not bad, but only up to a point.
When you look at our force now, you mentioned that we have more need for counterinsurgency operations from, I guess, conventional units. Is it feasible to think, though, that we could train that way? And the only reason I say that is just specifically the cost, right? I mean, as it is, defense is part of the largest part of our national budget, so to speak, and there's this constant fight to pare that number down and use that money elsewhere. But, that comes at a risk and an expense.
Yeah. How much of our defense budget, though, is for troops and training, though? How much of it is for equipment? How much of it is for the F-35 and F-22s or the aircraft carriers or the ballistic submarines? Now, each one of those is an important part, but you have to make choices. Also, a big chunk of our defense budget goes towards paying old guys like me. Retired pensions also make up a big part of it. So we have to make certain choices, and I'm not sure the military has done a good job of that. You see things like the B-52. That's one of the few things that I think is really amazing. We've made those aircraft last 70 years now almost. And so, and then we have these F-35s that you wonder if they're going to be combat capable or not. So you get what you pay for, not all the time. It's going to be choices. And I don't have all the answers. I don't have many of the answers. Let's put it that way.
In the declassification of Detachment A, what did you hope that people would learn about this unit? Like, what do you want them to take away from it? Because again, the greatest generation folks of World War II, they're all dying off, and as more time passes, that job that Detachment A did will become sort of in that same ilk that it'll become a time forgotten. So, what do you want people to know about Detachment A and remember?
Well, at the time I was writing the book, it was purely to get down on the paper the fact that the unit existed and there were at any one time 90 guys who were prepared to do this apparently suicidal mission to slow the Russians down. I wanted people to understand that there were actually people that were ready to do that. So it was for the families, it was for the men, and it was for the history of the unit. Had I not written that, maybe somebody else would have, but had that book not been written, we would never have any idea that unit even existed.
When you reflect upon your time in the military, and even in your time in the CIA, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Berlin was the highlight of my career in the Army and the CIA. One thing I have to say about Special Forces is it's very much about the teams. You hear the SEALs say that it's all about the teams, but it was definitely you're the 12 guys that were on the team, that became your world. And in Berlin, we were together for a long time doing difficult things and fun things. And you build up relationships. Some of the best relationships, most lasting relationships I've had with guys came out of Berlin. My time in the agency was also good, and some of the other military units I was in. But those are more individual experiences. You don't get to work with a whole lot of people a great deal. The only exception being, the Special Projects Division within the agency, which is essentially their military unit. I didn't do that though. I did traditional work. So it's a different experience. There you experience your excitement or your highs and your lows all by yourself. When you're in Berlin or on a Special Forces team, when you experience something, you experience it with a brotherhood. And that was a very special time.
Well, again, the book is called Special Forces Berlin, Clandestine Cold War Operations of the U.S. Army's Elite from 1956 to 1990. And listen, Jim, it's incredible. I learned something new almost every time I do this podcast, but I've certainly learned a whole bunch new from you and your story of Detachment A. So I can't thank you enough for certainly sharing it and giving us a personal touch on the whole thing. But 23 years of a military career and post in the CIA and everything else, it's been an incredible run for you.
Well, we're trying. I appreciate your having me on, Mark. I like talking about this book more than anything else I've written. It's especially good, I think, that the guys be recognized for what they were doing and what they were prepared to do. So it's a good thing all the way around, Mark. Thanks.
Well, Jim Stejskal, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground podcast. We appreciate it.
Take care, Mark. Stay safe and healthy.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.